Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm really glad to be here so I can talk to you about some of the work that the Lex Rex Institute is doing. And I'm particularly glad to be here in person because I gave this exact same presentation a couple of weeks ago on February 15th for the Orange County chapter of this organization. We subsequently uploaded that video to our YouTube channel, and it was removed for violating YouTube's terms of service. According to them, we were claiming that widespread voter fraud had changed the 2020 election. Well, I actually didn't make that claim. If they concluded from the evidence that I presented in that presentation that there had been widespread voter fraud resulting in a change to the 2020 election, that was their conclusion. It was not from what I said in my presentation. Yeah. So, I suppose they're free to conclude that, but they're going to be seeing us in court over that decision. So tonight I'm here to talk to you primarily about the issue of voter fraud, and specifically, I actually don't really like the term voter fraud. I think that's too narrow. Instead, what I like to talk about is the idea of election integrity. Regularity of our elections. They are regularly conducted. So where does election irregularity come from? Is that something new? Well, it turns out that no, that's actually not new at all. It's actually very, very old. There's been voter fraud and various forms of irregularity really since we began having elections. All the way back in ancient Rome, what they used to do is if a magistrate really wanted to win an election, they would go to the augurs. Well, who were the augurs? They were sort of the priests of ancient Rome. And a magistrate would say, gee, I think I'm really unpopular with the farmers. So could you just find some bad portents for the election for today's date? Because I know next week's the harvest. All the farmers are going to be busy harvesting their crops. They're not going to be able to come to the polls. So the augurs would find ill portents of an election, bad omens, that something was going to happen bad on the day when the election was supposed to be held, and they would delay it. Or in other instances, rather than delaying it, they would say, well, we're going to hold the election over multiple successive days so that they could get one group or another a higher voter turnout than they would otherwise have. That's manipulation of the electoral process. Cicero, who's sort of the progenitor of my profession, is regarded as history's greatest lawyer, certainly his most famous, actually commented on this. And he said that according to a law called the Lex Casilla Didata, they were actually prohibited from changing election laws within 24 days prior to an election, but they did that anyway. Now, we actually have a similar doctrine in the U.S. It's called the Purcell Doctrine. That creates sort of a presumption against any changes to electoral law right before an election takes place. But as you can guess, that was similarly ignored, specifically in 2020, for the ill portents that I guess were, indicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, so let's jump forward a few millennia. Looking at 1844 in New York, 55,000 votes were counted in that election. Well, that's pretty good considering the population of New York in 1844 was 41,000. That's a 131% voter turnout. We're always having these initiatives to get more people to the polls. We could do exactly what the Tammany Hall folks did back in the 1840s. You can get a 131% turnout.
I think they did that. They did that.
I'm not going to voice my opinion on whether they did that this time. We want this video to stay up, which I'm sure it won't.
Right.
But if it went on in 1844, it certainly could still go on. In the 1960 election, the election was actually almost certainly swung by Chicago and Texas. A journalist by the name of Earl Mazzo actually reported going through the cemetery in Chicago and looking at the tombstones, and then comparing those tombstones against voter rolls for the city of Chicago, and finding that nearly all of the names that he saw on those tombstones were still in the voter rolls. He went through those voter rolls and he actually saw another instance where a house was listed as having 56 people living at it, at a single family residence. So he figured, maybe this is a mansion. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to check, because it could be, maybe some poor widows taking in a bunch of people and they're all voting. It could be valid. Let's go check it out. So we went there. All the windows were broken. All the paint was peeling off. All the trees outside were dead. Ivy was growing on the front. Nobody had lived there for at least 10 years. The house is entirely gutted.
Wow.
So it's gone on, and it went on in 1860. It went on in 1960. It went on in 1844. It went on in 100 BC. It's gone on for a while, and we'd be fools if we didn't think that it still went on today. There is no such thing as a perfectly secure election. It just doesn't happen. There is too much incentive to swing an election one way or the other. There's always going to be fraud, so you want to make sure that you have instruments in place, systems in place that allow you to A, protect against that fraud, B, identify where that fraud occurs, and C, seek remedy against that fraud when you know that it has occurred.
100%.